find yourself in a meeting where everybody's asked to introduce themselves, and often that begins with a prompt like, tell me about yourself. And pretty quickly we're used to these kind of conversations. We start with our name and rank and serial number, right? We tell things about who we are, maybe if we're talking at work about how long you've been working at the company, if it's a church, how long you've been a member, if it's a big family gathering, you introduce what branch of the family tree you're from. But when you go a little bit deeper, when you move beyond just your name and how long you've been with the company, when somebody asks you to introduce yourself, to say something about yourself, you probably start telling stories. Or when families get together and they remember the saints or members of the family who are at their rest, those who have died, and they're catching up the family members about, oh, you never got to know Great Aunt Edna, she was great, and then start telling stories about Great Aunt Edna or Uncle Frank or our great-grandfathers or people who have come before us. And when we get beyond just their names and a couple of basic adjectives, oh, they were so lovely, oh, they were so kind, oh, he was so strong, she was such a curmudgeon, quickly we move into storytelling. The way we get to know each other, the way we introduce each other in the world so often is in stories. Stories that reveal the kind of people that we are, the things that matter to us, and that reveal our character. Sometimes I think we church folk forget that at the heart of who Jesus is this actual living, breathing person, and not just an idea or a summary of a couple of bullet points in a creed, but that Jesus is a knowable person with a personality and likes and dislikes and a character. And that means that Jesus is somebody as knowable and relatable as your dearest friend, your closest relative, or someone you look up to as a role model. All of those. Whatever other things we have to say about Jesus. And we will say things, we Christians, like he is God from God, light from light, true God from true God. Jesus is also a person who's knowable, who's relatable, and who we are invited into friendship with, as well as discipleship following beside him. And this year, as we begin our study in Mark's Gospel, I want to propose that part of why we've got these stories about Jesus is exactly for that reason, that you really get to know somebody through stories about them, through hearing their words, seeing their actions, or at least having them passed along. And that part of the reason that gospel writers like Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, part of the reasons they held on to stories about Jesus was so that that early Christian movement could know and relate to Jesus in that kind of way, and not just as an abstract concept in our head. After the first generation of actual disciples who had known Jesus started dying off, right? That whether they were being killed by the empire or they were driven off into exile or were just getting older, the church decided we need to have people who will hold on to the stories for us. How can we hand them down? And I think importantly, the early Christian community didn't say, let's just settle for abstractions. We'll just say things like Jesus is wise or glorious or compassionate. But they told stories to show it, so that the followers of Jesus, each generation later, even the ones who never met Jesus in the flesh, would understand we're in relationship with a someone, with a who, and not just a what. And that our faith isn't just about abstract ideas, but that we are brought into relationship with a someone who calls us to follow him, but also who's someone who's knowable and relatable, who will challenge and stretch us because of that, but also who can be a comfort for us because he's real, because he's a person and not just an idea. There's this line from the graphic novel V for Vendetta. Maybe a weird place for a Bible study to go, but there's a line that says, ideas cannot bleed. And in the book, that's supposed to be a positive, a strength about ideas, right? You can kill people if they are troublesome, but ideas can't bleed. I think the flip side is true for us in the Christian faith. What makes Jesus so compelling is that he doesn't just bring ideas about God or about the world that will live after any of our lifetimes, but that in Jesus we get someone who can bleed, who does lay his life down for us, who doesn't just give us ideas or abstractions, but brings us love that is willing to lay down its life for us. And that's why it's a big deal that we get these stories we're going to be exploring in what we call the Gospel according to Mark. Our first session is this week, and if you're not able to be with us in person, I'm wanting to give at least some of the highlights of where we're starting our conversation in the first chapter of Mark's Gospel. And the thing that amazes me about Mark is, as a beginning, it's abrupt, it's sort of right into the action. It's what the old literature teachers of my memory would say, in media res. In other words, Mark begins sort of right in the middle of the action. He doesn't start with, let me tell you about how Jesus was born. He doesn't start with prophecies about Jesus coming or his birth or angels or shepherds, any of those things that our other stories give us. But Mark starts with, I'm telling you right now, this is about Jesus. He's the Son of God. He's the Christ, the Messiah, and now I'm going to show you his life. And that's how things begin abruptly. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's his opening sentence. Nothing to warm up the crowd. No opening jokes or anything like that. Just Mark starts right in with, this is the good news of Jesus. Oh, and I'm telling you right now, I'm laying my cards on the table. I'm convinced Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, the one that ancient Israel had pinned their hopes on, and that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, it's important that Mark says that right from the beginning, even if it doesn't feel very artful in his way of leading up to it, because the whole rest of Mark's storytelling is going to take a look at how Jesus upends everybody's expectation about what it means to be the Christ, the Messiah. For everybody else in Jesus' time, people have heard that word, that title, Christ, Messiah, and they have clear expectations about what that means. We'll be exploring that as our study through the gospel goes on. But Mark is laying his cards on the table at the beginning to say, I want you to know, this Jesus, I'm convinced, he's God's Messiah. He's the Christ we've been waiting for. He's in fact God's own Son. And I'm telling you that now because Jesus is about to do things that don't look like what a respectable Messiah or a respectable Son of God would do. Jesus is going to hang out with all the wrong people, refuse to conquer or dominate people, lay down his life, and it's going to look like defeat and rejection. It's going to look like Jesus is breaking God's rules, and it's going to turn out that this is Jesus' way of embodying God's reign in the world. So Mark's telling us right from the beginning who Jesus is. And now as the story unfolds, part of the challenge and part of the wonder is watching how other characters, other figures in the story either recognize Jesus and affirm, yep, Jesus is God's Son, or how often the respectable religious people, the people you would expect to know something about God, are so dense or so hard-hearted in their assumption of their certainty of what God is and isn't allowed to do, they miss out on recognizing Jesus. And along the way, Jesus' handpicked followers, disciples like you and me, struggle to recognize Jesus along the way. So there's where things begin. And as our study continues throughout all these chapters, I'm going to ask you to keep your own notes about who are the figures who recognize Jesus, who are the ones who don't recognize Jesus, who are the voices who say something clearly to say who Jesus is, and what are the things that finally show people about Jesus' identity. Because it's not the kinds of things people might have expected in the first century. People might have expected conquering general, war hero, king, emperor, or something like that. And they would have said, we'll spot the Messiah when he comes because he'll be so powerful, or glorious because it'll be obvious. And instead Jesus shows up in all the ordinariness of being this itinerant homeless rabbi who makes friends with all the wrong people, who lays his life down and who serves rather than demanding being served. So Mark starts his story intentionally saying, I'm telling you right now, he is the Messiah, because everything else he does is going to defy your expectations. From there, Mark sort of zooms out and gives us the slimmest bit of backstory of the figure who came on the scene before Jesus, preparing the way, so to speak. Mark says it this way. He starts quoting the prophets. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, see, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And then he introduces us to John, this figure, John the Baptizer, who takes up as his personal mission offering a way for people to start over again in their lives when they felt like they had messed up. He offers this ritual moment, and it's pretty clear John didn't just invent this out of whole cloth, but that maybe he'd taken some of the cleansing rituals that were part of ancient Judaism and sort of morphing them into something new. Part of ancient Judaism had this practice of regularly cleansing yourself, not just for sanitary purposes, nobody has invented germ theory yet, but cleansing yourself from ceremonial uncleanliness. And that came to be sort of associated with, well, if maybe your heart or your life is tainted by sin, we can be washed from that and then you start over again. It was this regular ritual part of ancient Judaism. And John sort of morphs that into, what if there's a dramatic turnaround in your life? What if you realize you're headed in the wrong direction and you're at a dead end and you want to turn back in a way that fits with God's character, that you want to have God as the one arranging and directing your life instead of anybody else or anyone else setting the agenda. So you go to John and he would dunk you in the water. The Greek word baptizo, what we get our word baptize from, it's just a word for dunking. So he'd plunge you down into the water and bring you up as a symbol both of sort of cleansing, that the old life had been washed away, but also sort of this decisive turn. Down you go and up you come, and now you are starting over again, a brand new clean slate, so to speak. And Jesus finds himself in that line of people as well, alongside all these other people who are looking to turn their lives around, who are saying publicly, I've messed up and I'm looking to start over again. Jesus also gets baptized there as well. This is our introduction to Jesus. This is his first scene in Mark's gospel, is adult Jesus as just a face in the crowd of people. We'll have to explore in further conversation why Jesus would be baptized. Does Jesus have sins to confess? Is Jesus repenting of something? I don't think so. But I do think it's important that as the story begins, it starts with people who have messed up, people who are publicly owning, yep, I've screwed up, I've sinned, I've turned from God, I haven't done it all right, and I want to start over again. Is there that hope for me? Is there the possibility of starting over for me? And that Jesus' ministry starts with Jesus as a face in the crowd of people gathering to have that moment of turning around from sin, of being forgiven, of starting over again. That's where God's work happens. Not with the people who pretend they've got it all right all the time. Not with the people who are decreeing rules for other people to follow, but with the people who messed up and are owning it. That's where things begin. That's where Jesus' mission begins. And as we take a look at who Jesus is in our lives, it's worth recognizing our first introduction is Jesus as that face standing alongside the other mess-ups and sinners and screw-ups like you and me, that Jesus isn't ashamed to be seen with them or embarrassed with them or scowling or judging them or wagging his finger about their messing up, but finding himself right alongside them. The first thing to say then about maybe who Jesus is and how Jesus is a surprising kind of Messiah is that instead of zapping all the rule breakers, all the unrighteous and all the sinners, Jesus comes alongside them like he's a face in the crowd alongside them, even though presumably Jesus doesn't have sins to confess or repentance that is required, but he's not ashamed of hanging out with all the rest of us mess-ups and saying, these are my people, count me with them. That's later going to get Jesus in trouble when he makes it explicit. What's kind of assumed or implied here is going to become explicit pretty quick when Jesus publicly says, of course I'm hanging out with all the sinners and mess-ups and failures and outcasts. That's exactly who I've been sent to. But even here, in this implicit, subtle way, Jesus is hanging out with people that sometimes the respectable guardians of religion would be embarrassed to hang out with. Jesus intentionally hangs out with people like that who are just trying to get their lives back together again. So as we make our running list of who Jesus is or how we're introduced to Jesus, beyond Mark starting with, he's the Messiah, let's start here. Jesus is not just the Messiah, but he's not embarrassed to hang out with sinners and mess-ups and failures. Jesus is, even from his opening presence, shows up as the friend of sinners and mess-ups like you and like me. And honestly, like a whole world full of people who are afraid to darken the doors of churches, but are aching to hear that there is a new beginning for them, that they're beloved, that they're worthy, and that there's purpose for their life. That's where Mark's gospel begins, and that's where our conversation and our study here, Meeting Jesus, starts as well. We hope you'll join us next time for more conversation as we work our way through Mark's gospel and get to know Jesus as a person beyond just being a set of ideas. Join us each week here as we explore Mark's gospel and get to know Jesus better.